Good morning and welcome to today's webinar to explore findings from the Nation's Report Card 2014 U.S. History, Geography, and Civics. I'm Mary Crovo, Deputy Executive Director of the National Assessment Governing Board and moderator for today's discussion. The National Assessment Governing Board is a nonpartisan organization created by Congress to set policy for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, also known as the Nation's Report Card. As many of you know, NAEP is the largest ongoing nationally representative assessment of student achievement in the United States. We are excited to convene today's discussion about the 2014 NAEP U.S. History, Geography, and Civics reports. These three separate assessments, administered by our partners at the National Center for Education Statistics, show how students' knowledge of our nation's past, global geography, and the fundamentals of democratic government has changed over time. Throughout today's webinar, we encourage you to join an ongoing Twitter chat about the results using the hashtag NAEP. We have with us today a panel of experts who will share their thoughts on the reports and their implications and will respond to questions from our audience. Peggy G. Carr, Acting Commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES, will present the results of the U.S. History, Geography, and Civics assessments. Dr. Carr joined NCES in 1993 as Director of Analysis and Reporting in the Assessment Division. In 1998, she was named the Associate Commissioner of Assessment, responsible for national and international large-scale assessments. She previously served as the Chief Statistician in the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education and as a research methodologist at Howard University's Statistical and Research Computer Laboratory. We also have Chastity White, an 8th grade history and geography teacher at Brookwood Middle School in Brookwood, Alabama, and member of the National Assessment Governing Board. In 2014, the Tuscaloosa County School System named Ms. White Overall Teacher of the Year for Secondary Education. Ms. White also has international experience developing and teaching curriculum in Indonesia, studying educational policy in Rwanda, and researching peace education in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. Finally, we have Michelle Herzog, President of the National Council for the Social Studies, the nation's largest association devoted solely to social studies education. She is also the History Social Science Consultant for the Los Angeles County Office of Education, serving 80 school districts across Los Angeles County. Dr. Herzog serves on the California Task Force on K-12 Civic Learning and the Steering Committee for Your Constitution, the Power of Democracy, a civics education initiative. Before we begin, Jennifer Bocchieri, our webinar producer, will review logistics for the webinar platform. Jennifer?
Thank you, Mary. As Mary mentioned, our panelists will respond to questions from the audience during the webinar. To submit a question, simply type it into the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen, and then be sure to click on the send button. Please include your full name and the name of your organization with your questions. And note that you can submit your questions at any time during the webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send us a note using that chat box as well, and we will assist you as soon as possible. Finally, to view closed captioning, please click on the closed captioning link, which you can find in the links box on the left-hand side of your screen. Mary, back to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Peggy Carr to present the results of the Nation's Report Card 2014 U.S. History, Geography, and Civics. Peggy?
Thank you, Mary. Good morning. I'm here today to release the results of the 2014 U.S. History, Geography, and Civics assessment of 8th grade students for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the Nation's Report Card. The NAEP social science assessments help to measure students' understanding of the origins and evolution of the nation, the ability to seek and systematically apply the knowledge and skills of geography and life situations, and their understanding of American government and the workings of a civil society. The last time NAEP assessed students in these three subjects was 2010. For the first time, these results and more are available in an online interactive report. The U.S. History, Geography, and Civics assessments were administered nationally between January and March of 2014. More than 29,000 eighth graders took the assessment. Each student was assessed in only one subject. Overall, results are based on the performance of both public and private school students. Student performance is presented in two ways, as average scores and as the percentage of students at the various achievement levels, basic, proficient, and advanced. The NAEP achievement levels are set by the National Assessment Governing Board, which sets policy for NAEP and oversees the development of the assessment frameworks. NAEP scale scores tell us what students know and can do, while the NAEP achievement levels provide standards for what students should know and be able to do. NAEP also reports the percentage of students' responses to questions about their views on each subject area and to survey questions. In 2014, 18% of students performed at or above proficient in U.S. history, 27% in geography, and 23% in civics. Since 2010, there has been no statistically significant changes in students' average scores in any of these three subjects. You can see the percentage of students at the below basic, proficient, and advanced levels on this bar chart. You may notice that the scores and percents may not sum to the expected totals. This is due to rounding. We will see this throughout this presentation today. Now we'll look at the results of the 2014 U.S. History Assessment in detail. Approximately 11,200 students from 450 schools participated in the U.S. History Assessment. The U.S. History Assessment framework identifies 4 themes in American history. And we can see the percentage of time given to each of these themes on this slide. Later, we will see performance results for each theme. The first theme is democracy, change and continuity in American democracy from colonial times to the present, focusing on ideas, institutions, events, key figures, and controversies. The second theme is culture, the gathering and interaction of people, cultures, and ideas in American society. The third theme is technology, economic and technological changes and their relationship to society, ideas, and the environment. And the final theme is world role, which focuses on the changing ideas, institutions, and ideologies that affect American foreign relations. In 2014, grade 8 students had an average score of 267 on a 0 to 500 point scale, which was higher than their average score of 259 in 1994, but not significantly different from their score of 266 in 2010. Note that prior to the 2001 assessment, accommodations were not permitted, as indicated by the dashed line. For both scale scores and achievement level performance, we will be making comparisons back to the previous assessments, concentrating on comparisons between the first assessment year and the most recent prior assessment year, 2010. When making these comparisons, we must remember that all NAEP results are based on samples from the overall population of students. This means that there is a margin of error associated with every score and percent. When discussing changes in student performance, either increases or decreases, we only discuss those that are statistically significant, that is, those that are that have a larger than the margin of error. In the tables and figures that show, an asterisk is used to indicate statistically significant differences, comparing results from previous assessments to 2014. In addition to reporting average scores for each assessment, scores are reported on 5 percentiles, or reported at 5 percentiles to show trends in results for students performing at the lower, that would be the 10th, and the 25th percentiles, middle, that would include the 50th percentile, and higher levels, that would include the 75th and the 90th percentile. At all 5 percentiles, student scores were higher in 2014 than in 1994, but not statistically different from 2010. So there was improvement across the range of performance since the first assessment year. Looking back at the themes we mentioned earlier, we see an increase in the performance in democracy since 2010. Since 1994, there were increases in democracy, culture, and world role. Let's take a look at the percentage of students at various achievement levels and how they have changed over time. 8th grade students performing at the proficient level should be able to explain the significance of people, places, events, ideas, and documents, and to recognize the connections between people, events within a historical context. On the far right, we see the percentage of those students increased from 14% in 1994 to 18% in 2014. On the left, the percentage of students performing below basic decreased from 39% in 1994 to 29% in 2014, while the percentage of students performing at basic increased from 48% to 53% in the same period. There were no changes at any achievement level compared to 2010. It is useful to look beyond overall scores, though, because student groups perform differently. The column on the left shows average scores for each student group in 2014, while the right two columns show score changes compared to previous assessments. Looking at scores and score changes, we see increases since 1994 for all student groups except private school students. In addition, scores for both white and Hispanic students increased since 2010, even though we saw that the overall scale score did not increase. Since 2010, scores have not changed for either male or female students. A gap between male and female students appeared in 2006 and has persisted since male students' scores have increased more than those of female students. Neither public nor private school students' scores changed since 2010. On NAEP assessments, students are asked about multiple choice and constructive response questions. Here's an example of the constructive response questions related to democracy theme and U.S. history. This question deals with change and continuity in American democracy. Specifically, it addresses the actions that African Americans took during the Civil War to secure their freedom and rights as citizens. 27% of 8th graders gave a complete response. Responses were rated as complete if students correctly answered both parts of the question. Students scoring in the proficient range were likely to provide a complete response. Next, we'll look at the results of the 2014 geography assessment, in which approximately 9,000 students from 450 schools participated. The geography assessment framework identifies 3 content areas: space and place at 40% of the assessment time, deals with knowledge related to particular places on Earth, spatial patterns on the Earth's surface, and physical and human processes that shape such patterns. Environment and society at 30% deals with knowledge related to the interaction between the environment and society and how people adapt to, depend on, or are affected by, and modify the natural environment. And spatial dynamic connections, excuse me, at 30% deal with knowledge related to spatial variations and connections among people and places. NAEP reports average scores for these three content areas. Looking at students' performance in geography, we see that 8th grade students had an average score of 261 on a 0 to 500 point scale in 2014, which was not statistically different from their average score in the first assessment, 1994, nor from their score in 2010. But we see when we look at behind the average score that there has been improvement for some student groups. The figure shows that students' performance increased at the 10th percentile and at the 25th percentile in 2014 compared to 1994. Students performing at the other percentiles show no difference in their average score since 1994. The average score did not change for any percentile group since 2010. There were no significant changes by geography content area compared to 2010, but there was an increase in space and place since the first assessment. Though you cannot see it here, there were improvements in various geography content areas for all racial ethnic groups. For example, scores for Hispanic students increased in space and place and in spatial dynamics and connections compared to 2010. 8th grade students performing at the proficient level should possess a fundamental geographic vocabulary, understand geography's analytical concepts, solve locational questions requiring integration of information from one or two sources, such as atlases or globes, compare information presented at different scales, and identify a wide variety of physical and cultural features and describe regional patterns. The percentage of students performing at or above proficient in 2014 was not changed since 1994 or 2010. The percentage of students performing below basic, however, decreased since 1994, while the percentage of students performing at basic increased over the same time period. So, here we see the bottom of the performance distribution coming up, that is, students moving from the below basic to the basic level. Although overall scores have not changed, looking at scores and score changes by race ethnicity, we see increases since 1994 for white, black, and Hispanic students. In addition, the score for Hispanic students increased since 2010. Although it is not shown here, the score gaps between white and Hispanic students and white and black students were narrower in 2014 compared to 1994. There were no score changes for gender or by type of school, however, for either year. Although one might expect to see maps in the geography assessment, many other aspects of geography are also assessed. So, for example, this sample constructive response question in which students were asked to compare and explain differences in life expectancy across countries measures students' performance in spatial dynamics and connections. The first part asks students to compare data in a table related to life expectancies in 12 countries and describe the pattern. In the second part, students were to give 2 factors that help explain the pattern shown in the table. The question was difficult for students. 22% received ratings of complete or acceptable. This question was likely to be answered with a complete response by students scoring at the advanced achievement level. Finally, we'll look at the results of the 2014 Civics Assessment. Now, unlike U.S. history and geography, civics does not have subscales, and scores are reported on a 0 to 300-point scale. Also, the first assessment year for civics was 1998. Approximately 9,100 students from 410 schools participated in the civics assessment. The assessment measures students' knowledge of the American constitutional system and of the workings of a civil society. It also requires students to demonstrate a range of intellectual skills, that is, identifying and describing important information, explaining and analyzing it, and evaluating information and defending positions with appropriate evidence and careful reasoning. Students were asked in 5 areas of civic knowledge, where they were asked questions in 5 areas of civic knowledge. The framework does not specify reporting by subscales, however, but the items can be classified by knowledge component. These components are displayed here on this slide, as well as the percentage of time allotted to each in the framework. Looking at student performance in civics, we see that grade 8 students had an average score of 154 in 2014, which was an increase from 150 in the first assessment year, but was not statistically different from their average score of 151 in 2010. By percentile, we see increases in average scores in 2014 amongst students at the 10th, 25th, and 50th percentile compared to 1998. Average scores did not change for any percentile group since 2010. We can get a more detailed picture of students' performance by looking at achievement levels. 8th grade students performing at the proficient level should understand and be able to explain purposes that government should serve. These students should have a good understanding of differences between government and civil society and of the importance of the rule of law. The percentage of students performing at or above proficient in civics in 2014, 23% was not changed since either 1998 or 2010. But notice that the percentage of students performing below basic decreased since 1998, while the percentage of students performing at basic increased over the same period. This pattern is similar to the increase in performance among lower performing students that we saw in the previous slide. Here we have scores and score changes for different student groups. By race and ethnicity, we see increases in average scores since 1998 for white and Hispanic students. In addition, the score for white students increased since 2010. In 2014, there was no difference in the scores of male and female students. This is a change from 1998, when female students score higher. Male students' scores have increased over this period, while female students' scores have not. So the score gap that existed in 1998 is no longer present in 2014. Scores for public school students increased since 1998 but did not change since 2010. This multiple choice question from the Civics Assessment measures students' performance in politics and government. It requires students to recognize contemporary examples of particular types of government. 54% of the students chose the correct answer. That would be choice B. Students performing at the proficient level were more likely to answer this question correctly. So, in summary, it is important to emphasize that the lack of score changes overall from the previous assessment is not the complete story. For example, white students showed improvement in both U.S. history and civics since the previous assessment. Turning to Hispanic students, their performance improved in both U.S. history and geography from the first assessment. So the gains by these two groups are masked if one just focuses on the overall changes. Another finding was the bottom of the performance distribution improving when compared to the first assessment year. 1994 for U.S. history and geography, and 1998 for civics. We observed this change when looking at how the distribution of students across the achievement levels has shifted. Here you see that the percentage of students at or above basic has increased, while this is not shown here. The proportion and the proportion of populations below basic has decreased. The last thing I would like to discuss pertains to the contextual items we ask students to complete as part of the NAEP assessment. Analyzing these items allows students to make connections between learning context and assessment performance. The example I will discuss here asks questions about the different study materials students use to learn about U.S. history. You can see at the bottom of the slide that students who reported reading materials from a textbook decreased from 73% in 2010 to 64% in 2014. This decrease corresponded with an increase in the percentage of students who reported using technology-based materials at least weekly when studying U.S. history. As you can see, these technology-based materials included watching movies and videos, using computers, and listening to information online. This final category of using letters and diaries and essays written by historical people is included here because of the use of technology. That technology facilitates access to these primary resources. You can view this report card online and to explore these results and many more. In conclusion, as always, I would like to offer my sincere thanks to the students, the teachers, the schools who participated in the 2014 U.S. History, Geography, and Civics Assessment. Back to you, Mary.
Thank you, Peggy. Those were very compelling results. Our audience has submitted some questions about the reports that we'd appreciate your insight on. First, several of our attendees, including Paula Hutton of the Maine Department of Education and Catherine Kimmel of Linchpin Strategies, have asked about state-level data. The question is, why are there no state-level data for these assessments, and when will these subjects be tested so that state data are available? Peggy?
Well, this particular assessment focused on a national sample. While we did collect data from students and schools across the country, we did not do so in such a manner that we could report on state-level data. Hopefully in 2014, when we assess the data, 2014, with this assessment, we will have both 4th and 12th grade data, but there's still no plans for state-level data.
Thank you, Peggy. Next, we have a question that I'll address first, but I'd like your feedback on this one as well, Peggy. Michael Solem, Director of Educational Research and Programs at the Association of American Geographers, asks, will geography data be collected for 4th and 12th grade students as was done in prior NAEP geography assessments? As Peggy mentioned, our next assessment year for these three areas is 2018, and at that time, the board schedule calls for assessments at the national level in both 8th and 12th grades, assuming we get the required funding for the NAEP program. We would continue moving forward with those grade levels and perhaps even in the future doing 4th grade as well, but of course it is a resource issue. Peggy, thoughts on this question?
Well, the only thing I would add is that there is going to be a change in the format of data collection in 2018. The goal is to have it to be a technology-based or digital-based data collection, and it will be a much more, I think, engaging and enriching assessment on tablets than in the paper-pencil format that was administered in 2014.
Thank you, Peggy. That's an excellent point. Now our panelists will share their thoughts and reactions to the report's findings. First, we will hear from Chastity. Chastity, what are your reactions to these reports, and what do you think they tell us about the way students are learning about these subjects within and outside of the classroom?
Too often, subjects in the social studies realm often take a back seat. There's much emphasis these days on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and even the language arts. Of course, those subjects are important, but subjects like history, geography, and civics are equally important. Learning about the major historical events and changes over time, the countries of the world and their inhabitants, and the fundamentals of government and responsibilities of citizenship all contribute to today's students being well-rounded contributors to society now and in the future. I'm pleased to see the nation's report card being the nation's only representative measure of student achievement in U.S. history, geography, and civics, especially as I've taught world history and geography for nearly a decade. Today's results do show that there hasn't been a statistically significant increase in any of the 3 subjects since our last assessment year of 2010. And there have been no significant changes in the geography scores for 8th graders since the first assessment year of 1994. However, it is encouraging to see improvement over the long haul. Since 1994, the first year of the NAEP U.S. History Assessment, the average score for 8th graders has increased by 8 points. And compared to 1998, the first year of the NAEP Civics Assessment, the average score for 8th graders has increased by 4 points. So how do we maintain improvement and increase achievement over time? A significant key is how students are taught and how they learn. At my middle school in Alabama, I use what's called a flipped classroom model. For those who may not be familiar with that concept, flipped learning brings interactive engagement to classroom by having students learn content online, usually at home, and homework is done in class with teachers and students discussing questions and solving problems. Teacher interaction with students is more personalized, and it can be seen as offering more guidance than lecturing. So let's say we're studying the rainforest in my geography class. What I would do before we even start the lesson in my class is have my students watch a video clip, download a webinar, or peruse a website before we even have our first conversation. I also am a big user of resources through the History Channel. They often have short video clips on many subjects that I have had my students pull up a link and watch a program on a topic that we will learn in class. So instead of the classroom discussion being teacher-centered, students take more ownership of their learning, and they come to class more prepared and eager to do research on their own. The contextual variables in the NAEP U.S. History, Geography, and Civics Assessment demonstrate this increasing use of technology. Through all 3 subjects, there is an interesting trend. The percentage of students who reported reading from a textbook at least weekly was lower in 2004 than in 2010. However, over these 4 years, we see higher percentages of students engaging in related activities such as watching movies or videos, using a computer at school for their subjects, and listening to information presented online. Students are clearly absorbing information from other sources beyond textbooks and classroom discussion. Using interactive means will be an important method to get students more excited and interested in their subjects, and hopefully increase performance in the process. Digital technology can allow students to engage more in history, civics, and geography, and develop more critical thinking skills to help them reach their full academic potential. Interactive and technological components can also help enhance the overall rigor of the subject disciplines. How something is taught makes as much difference as what is taught. More forward-thinking instruction and learning can really make a difference in the academic achievement of U.S. history, civics, and geography, all important subjects that I'm very grateful NAEP recognizes and will continue to assess in the future.
Thank you very much, Cassidy. I now have a few questions from our audience. Elaine Weiss, National Coordinator for the Broader, Bolder Approach to Education, asks, how has our increasingly narrow focus on reading and math affected learning in these important subjects, meaning the social studies areas? Cassidy?
It definitely has affected the learning process in social studies. And I think one of the main things teachers can do, it starts in the teacher training colleges across our nation, training our pre-service educators the importance of teaching civics and history and geography much more in the early grades. And so when they are learning at their teacher training colleges that teaching these social studies subjects are so important, then that will trickle out into the classroom.
Michelle, would you care to comment on that question?
Well, I think she's right. You know, putting a more integrated approach, more emphasis on these higher order thinking skills can really bode well for students and their ability to perform in these areas.
Thank you. Our next question is from Rhonda Watton, past president of the Wisconsin Council for the Social Studies and a teacher at Templeton Middle School. She asks, what can we do to integrate more social studies into the elementary schools? Chastity?
Again, I think it starts at the teacher training colleges around the country, and it also starts with inspiring teachers to understand the importance of social studies education.
Thank you. Michelle, do you have something?
Yeah, I would add to that by saying, you know, we're putting more of an emphasis now on reading informational texts, using more academic language in schools, and what better place to put text in front of students in their learning to read process than to give them text from the social studies and the sciences. So integrating that and not treating reading as a separate silo, but as an integrated approach. Some of my colleagues say you just don't read reading, you read content. And so this is an opportunity to really integrate reading with the social studies and the other content areas.
Thank you very much. Great comments. Now we will turn the conversation over to Michelle. Michelle, what are your reactions to these reports, and what are some of the implications for our nation's students and for the state of social studies education?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. We're so appreciative of the National Assessment Governing Board for putting attention on the social studies with these recent results and providing this opportunity for commentary, because this is a powerful snapshot of how students across the nation are doing in these subject areas, and the findings, as you are seeing, have really powerful implications for teaching, for learning, and for policy in these areas, not just for social studies, but for all of education. When we saw the data earlier presented that showed that only 18% of 8th graders tested scored at or above proficient in U.S. history, only 27% at or above proficient in geography, and only 23% in civics, that is just startling statistics that really require our attention. And the fact that we've seen virtually no improvement in the last 4 years is something that we need to pay close attention to and respond to. the question should beg for everyone, if we step back from this, how do we as a nation, if we think about this, maintain our status in the world if future generations of Americans don't even understand basic United States history, geography, or the civic principles and practices that define our democratic way of life? We know that there's a number of incredible events, complex situations around the world that are occurring around internet surveillance, terrorism, human rights violations, poverty, race relations. These issues are extremely compelling and very complex, and to be able to respond to them in important ways, responsible ways, really requires a deep understanding of the historical context of these events, the geographic context of the situations, the political constraints, and of course, what is the potential impact of all of these things on the society at large, the economies of different nations in the world, the environment, and world affairs. So we all know by watching the news, the world is growing more complex, not less, and yet when we see low scores and a lack of student growth in the social studies, that should be a call to action to all of us that we need to pay attention to this very carefully. As was mentioned by Chastity and others earlier, there's a lot of qualitative and quantitative data that shows how the social studies have been marginalized over the past decade. A lot more emphasis on reading scores, math scores, science has caused a lot of educators to prioritize those areas over other subjects. And I think now we need to pay attention back to providing that well-rounded education, particularly, and I'm glad that was mentioned, in the elementary grades, because those are the early years that set the foundation for the future. We know that history, geography, civics, and I will also add the other subjects of the social studies that weren't necessarily tested in this NAEP results, economics, philosophy, sociology, and psychology. These are important subjects that need to be taught separately and as distinct subjects. Now, of course, we know that the ability to read and write, listen and speak is certainly going to impact students' performance in all subject areas, but they also need to have and acquire knowledge found only in these social studies subjects to be able to understand the complex concepts of them, to use analytical skills, particularly, as Chastity points out, to be able to apply what they've learned in meaningful ways. So we need to be clear, social studies isn't about memorizing dates and facts, although understanding the context of dates and facts are important in the bigger picture. There's a number of historians, such as Fritz Fisher and others, who talk to us about the importance of students thinking like historians, to be able to analyze texts, primary and secondary sources for authenticity, understanding the context of an event in the past or the present, to be able to question an author's motives for writing a piece of text, and looking at multiple perspectives. We know that thinking like a geographer, not just memorizing points on a map, but thinking like a geographer calls on students to understand and realize the importance of time, place, and movement, and how to understand the impact of geography on people, places, and events, past, present, and future. And equally significant, if not more so, is the importance of having all students think and operate like citizens, to call upon young people to understand how our democratic government works, how other governments work, and to develop the skills to engage in civic practices and be part of our American democracy. The other thing I think is worthy of discussion is this issue of gaps. And we saw in the data that from the NAEP findings that we still have startling gaps in knowledge and skills among white and Asian students compared to black and Hispanic students. Achievement gaps in U.S. history, geography, and civics are significant, and we need to take note, have not improved much since 2010. So I hope people are asking themselves and questioning why we need to pay attention to this. And I would ask folks to step back and look at the larger picture. When we think back about the vision of our founding fathers to establish a representative democracy for us, put into place hundreds of years ago, that vision called for all members of our society to be represented, to have voice in legislatures, in political offices, in jury boxes, and particularly in voting booths. But unfortunately, there's a lot of data to suggest that this vision has yet to be realized for all people. We know there's research out there from Joseph Kahn at Mills College and Mira Levinson at Harvard University that reveal a civic opportunity gap, as they frame it, in schools across the nation. They cite white and Asian students and those of higher socioeconomic status are significantly more likely to engage in civic learning than their counterparts. So the question is, which groups will more likely leave high school with the knowledge, not just the knowledge, but the skills and dispositions to participate responsibly in civic life? Which groups will be prepared? Which groups will not be so prepared? How does that really reflect the vision of our founders in regards to we the people in democratic life? So those are important things. Now, I do want to end on a somewhat positive note because there's some reason for optimism in the social studies and the educational community. First of all, in 2013, the National Council for the Social Studies published the College, Career, and Civic Life C3 Framework for Social Studies State Standards. Now, this was a hugely collaborative effort developed by experts in social studies from state departments of education, colleges and universities, many of our professional organizations, nonprofits, and of course, a number of classroom teachers, writers, and editors. Now, right now, many states are using this document to update their state social studies standards, and it's also being used by teachers at the ground level to increase the rigor, provide an inquiry-based approach to social studies, to get kids to not only investigate issues of the past and present, but to analyze different pieces of information, look at perspectives, and finally, to apply what they've learned by taking informed action. This application of knowledge in the real world is a powerful frame for teaching social studies, and we're excited that so many are embracing that. And finally, another cause for optimism is the inclusion of social studies in the ESCA reauthorization bill recently introduced by Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee Chair Lamar Alexander and Ranking Member Patty Murray. Now, here's why we're excited. If this bill is signed into law as written, resources to strengthen social studies education will be available to local and state education agencies, higher education institutions, and other organizations. So we're very excited and hopeful that this will happen. So in summary, the NAEP results really call for three things. The fact that we're seeing low scores across the board in students' competencies in U.S. history, geography, and civics. The fact that we're not seeing any growth or any significant growth in the last 4 years, and this ongoing prevalence of gaps between different groups should really call upon the entire educational community as a call to action. And we are hopeful that these results will highlight the need to support social studies education as part of a well-rounded education for all students. Why? I think it's clear. World events increasingly demand informed, engaged problem solvers. Problem solvers that have the knowledge and skills found only in the teaching of civics, geography, history, economics, psychology, sociology, and philosophy. All of the social studies need to be a part of every student's education, kindergarten through grade 12. Why? Because the future of our communities, our nation, and our world depend upon it. Thank you for the opportunity to share my comments.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I have one question that we'll take from our audience, if you'd like to reply to that, Michelle. Joy Dingle with Achieving Equality asks, every few years, someone suggests that U.S. students should take a test similar to the citizenship test for naturalized citizens. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's a great question, and I have to say we're kind of excited that this question is bubbling up because there's no doubt that there is a basic body of knowledge around democratic practices and things found in these citizenship tests that need to be part of every student's understanding and takeaway. The concern we have is that it's not going far enough. So while we're glad that policymakers are paying attention to this issue, we don't want it to see a default, that it ends with just a multiple choice test. That to really prepare young people to be engaged, responsible citizens, they need to have the knowledge, but they need to have those rich opportunities to engage in civic life, to talk about current events in classrooms, to engage in dialogue that is respectful, that is balanced, that is civil, to have a place to talk about these controversial issues, investigate different points of view, analyze the different pieces of evidence, come up with conclusions, and then most importantly, opportunities to do something about it. If you don't like a rule or a law or the way things are working, democracy is a beautiful thing. You have an opportunity to reach out to your city council, your state legislators, sign petitions, vote in elections. And if we're not really clear and provide those kinds of opportunities, we've fallen a little short of truly preparing them. Anyone who subscribes to Ed Week, there's a marvelous article in there by Joe Kahn where he says, democracy thrives when citizens think critically and deeply about civic and political issues, when they consider the needs and priorities of others, and when they engage in informed action, not when they memorize a few facts. Let's make high-quality civic learning a priority. Let's not take the easy way out and pass laws in more than a dozen states that turn civic education into a game of trivial pursuit. So well-intentioned, eye on the prize, but let's go further and really prepare them with the knowledge, skills, and dispositions to be engaged citizens.
Thank you, Michelle. Chastity, do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with everything she said. It's so important in today's global society to make sure our students are ready to compete in a world that is changing every day and becoming more connected in an international setting. And so, yes, I totally agree.
Thank you, Michelle and Chastity. Thank you for your insights. Now we'll take some additional questions. My co-facilitator for this segment, Valerie Maripodi, will direct audience questions to one of our speakers, and other speakers may also comment. Valerie?
Thank you so much. We've received a lot of questions, both ahead of time and today during the online webinar. So we hope to respond to as many as possible during the time we have today. We'll be combining questions on similar topics, and the questions that we won't be able to get to today, we will answer later by email. Our first question here is for Peggy, and it is from Susan Griffin. She is wondering, how do you balance the desire for consistency in order to track trends with the most critical capacities of citizens today and tomorrow? How does NCES go about that, Peggy?
Well, first of all, I should say that these assessments are fairly large by any general standards of what a large-scale assessment would be, because we don't give any given student the entire assessment. So the framework covers territory, and the actual design of the assessment follows suit in that way. So there's a lot to be said about what students in the collective are asked. In addition, when we track this information over time, we keep the overwhelming majority of the assessment. We only release a couple of blocks or so per grade, so that we can maintain the trends over time. And when we do replace the items, they are matched for content and psychometric parameters and stability. So we are certain that we're picking up the target constructs and concepts and principles over time. We have, and I'll turn this over to Mary to respond in a minute, but we have times set aside, usually about every 10 years, where we take another look at these frameworks to see if they need to be tweaked or completely overhauled, and that is in the domain of the National Assessment and Governing Board. But again, the wide range covered by these assessments gives us confidence that they can withstand a time over over at least a decade or so.
Peggy, I absolutely agree. It is a very delicate but yet important balance. The title of this assessment program is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So it is in statute, in law, that the program must measure student achievement and trends over time. That is something that the board has been committed to since its inception in 1988. Yet we want to make sure that the content is relevant, it's fresh, and particularly in these rapidly changing areas of U.S. history, civics, and social and geography, where sometimes facts change, countries change, different dynamics, different issues. Michelle cited a number of them, as did Chastity. We want to make sure that that content is fresh and important and engaging. And as Peggy mentioned, the transition to digital-based assessments in 2018, the panels of experts are working as we speak to look at ways to incorporate more contemporary, more challenging, and more important content into these digital-based assessments. So we're very much looking forward to maintaining trend in 2018 and yet reflecting contemporary content as well.
Great, terrific insights. Thank you for those answers. The next question we have is from Timothy McDonnell. He's with the New York Geographic Alliance. And Michelle, I'm going to point this question to you first. As we're covering 3 subjects today, we do have some people that are passionate about certain subjects. So Timothy is asking, how can we ensure that geography is treated as an equal partner in social studies courses? Usually the teachers emphasize history above everything else. What are your thoughts on that, Michelle?
Well, yeah, I agree. I think it's an important question. You know, when you look at any event in history or present, you know, you've got to look at the intersection of all of these dynamics. So let's look, for example, you know, all of this discussion, say, on the establishment of the Keystone Pipeline. There's a historical context to that, to be sure, but there's a huge geographic context that goes with that, where it's placed, how it affects the people in those areas, what's the impact on the land, how movement of people. If we're not intentional in including that kind of conversation in the teaching of events, past, present, we're missing the boat because you're not getting a fuller picture. Look at the events going on in the Middle East. Geography is an important and critical conversation to be having in there, and geography, the way it's taught well now, and I'm sure our guests would agree, isn't about, you know, finding Fresno on a map or knowing your latitude and longitude. It's a much bigger context for understanding the implications of events and why things happen the way they do. So I know there are many that will call for a standalone geography course. Those are very often hard to fit into a student's schedule, but I would propose a more integrated approach, as he's suggesting, and particularly as you find it in the C3 framework, lots of examples on how to do that.
Great. And Chastity, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree. It's very important to understand why things are happening around the world. And we do have some courses in different states where geography is a standalone course, but I also think it is important that geography is, she's right, it's not about just locating a place on a map. It's about understanding. If I'm teaching a lesson on East Asia, students need to know not only the geography and the history of East Asia, but why are things going on over there and how does that relate to us? And so the interconnectedness of those subject areas is also very important.
Terrific, thank you. So Chastity, I have another question coming your way. This is from Claire Varner. She's wondering, what is your advice to ed tech companies in the social studies space that are creating resources used in those flipped classrooms that you mentioned following?
I think social studies needs a champion. We have so many great initiatives in other subjects, and social studies needs a champion in the ways of different types of methods that we can deliver to our students. And in those flipped classrooms, I think collaboration. My students love to listen to a webinar at home. They love to connect with people who are really making a difference. To give you an example, when we were studying CNN Heroes of the Year, my students with a flipped classroom at their homes sent letters and emails and spoke to some of the CNN Hero nominees. And when they came to my classroom, they had already spoken to some of the nominees via email or a webinar and had so much information to share. So I think collaboration and really understanding what it means. A flipped classroom doesn't mean that I just give my students all of the work to do at home and they come to me and discuss it. It's really about students, for the first time, really taking ownership of their learning and being excited and inspired to, at their homes, go in and research and come to class prepared for those intelligent discussions. So I think collaboration among, whether it's the History Channel or any type of educational program or corporation, to collaborate, to really understand how the importance of a flipped classroom done in the correct way can be a wonderful thing for a school.
Really great perspective. Michelle, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think this digital piece is a real game changer for social studies and the entire educational community. It has unleashed just exponential amounts of information that are available at your fingertips. And sending kids out to investigate all of this information and analyzing, finding conclusions from it is exciting but also challenging. One of the challenges we have is to help young people not only know where to go to get information, but how to read it critically, analyze it for authenticity, look for different perspectives, make sense of it, and come up with conclusions that they can act on in ways. So the digital citizenship piece is an important one. So we're hoping that people are not just sending kids out free-for-all on the Internet, but how to be cautious and informed consumers of information, how to make sure that they're finding information that's authentic, that's credible, weighing and analyzing it, and making good use of it. A lot of emphasis on that is really bearing out great instruction in classrooms.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So our next question is from Ted McConnell. He's with the Campaign for Civic Mission of Schools. And Peggy, this is a bit of a data question to clarify, but then also I want to turn to our panelists, Michelle and Chastity, for their insights as well. He's wanting to readdress the 27-point difference in scores between white and black students. Does this gap threaten to disenfranchise due to lack of acquiring basic civic knowledge and skills? Peggy, would you like to start us off?
Well, what I can do is to verify that these are real gaps, and they're persistent gaps, and they're in terms of what it means that these students know and are able to do. You can look at the score gaps on the item maps that we provide on the website, and you can see that this gap places in very different places in terms of their content and knowledge. I think I should leave it up to the content experts on this panel to extrapolate about what that would mean in the real world setting. But these gaps are there and they're consistent.
Thank you so much for that insight. Michelle, would you like to comment on that first?
Yeah, sure, and I'm glad this topic is part of the conversation, as I mentioned in my comments. I think this is something that bears important attention to. As I mentioned from the research that we saw from Mira Levinson and Joe Kahn, this is a reality. Now, we have seen that in our efforts to improve reading and math scores, in a lot of low-performing schools, students have been doubled up in reading, doubled up in math, from elementary all the way through high school. And students in those schools tend to be lower socioeconomic status and of minority groups. So they're not getting access to the rich opportunities to develop the knowledge, skills, and dispositions to become engaged, prepared citizens. So I ask people to step back, look at the big picture, look at the implications of that. When you think about we the people and who we the people should be representing, which groups are more likely to be prepared to hold office, to be inspired enough to go to voting booths, to vote for their person they want to see representing them, to serve in juries, who's going to have the power, and which groups are likely not. And it all comes down to how good a job are we in public schools and private schools in preparing all students to be actively engaged citizens. We need to do something about this. I think the future of our democracy really depends on it.
Thank you. And Chastity, do you have any points to add to that comment?
I agree 100%. I think it is something we definitely have to look at, and we have to see why there is that gap. And as an 8th grade teacher, I certainly don't have the answer to why that gap is there, but I do think that conversation needs to be had not just in a one-day webinar, but throughout our nation. And I think that's a very important topic to look at.
This is Peggy Carr. I think I should add one more insight to this gap on the data side. The white and Hispanic differences and the white and the black differences need to be taken into context in terms of the disproportionate representation of students who are low income. The black students and Hispanic students are disproportionately located in our lower income category of students. And white students have a large proportion as well, but not nearly what we see for these students. So part of the confound clearly is correlated with all of the factors that are associated with being poor and being deprived of the things that come along with resources. So we need to keep that in mind.
Thank you for that observation. Really great context. Thank you, Peggy. So our next question is from Brian Krause. He's with the Missouri Chamber of Commerce. And he was wondering, are there any examples of programs in public or private school settings that have really demonstrated improvement in performance in students among these subjects? Chastity and Michelle, do you have any insight to offer here? Any kind of concrete examples?
Well, I'll just say we have a plethora of great programs and resources and professional development in the social studies arena that address many of these issues that we're discussing today. Part of the challenge is getting them access into schools, getting schools and districts, allowing teachers, providing permission, allocating resources for them to do that. There's a number, without calling out any individual programs, there's a number of marvelous civic learning programs. Many of them are listed under the civicmissionofschools.org website that highlight, promote active, engaged citizen opportunities for kids all across the nation. They've got some great work going on. I know that at Stanford University, there's a lot of great history education type programming, thinking like a historian. A lot of programs modeled after that are getting students to think critically about historical events, past and events today. And of course, our geographic alliances, National Geographic, have tremendous programming as well that go into these deeper, more complex issues around geographic principles and ideas. So there's great resources out there, and of course, National Council for Social Studies, we work with all of these groups to help promote and get them in classrooms and in teachers' hands.
Great. And Chastity, do you have anything to add to that conversation?
I do. I think there are wonderful resources available to teachers. One such example that I use in my class is from the East Asian Studies Center at Indiana University. They have a large amount of resources that teachers from all over the United States can order or check out, so you will, from their resource catalog, and they will send it to you free of charge, and you can use whatever information or whatever resources they have, and then when you're finished you can send it back so they can send information to another teacher. They also have free webinars. That's also the 5 College Center for East Asian Studies in Massachusetts. They do a similar program where teachers from not just Massachusetts but all over the nation can have access to their digital webinars and information that they can send to you. And so there are so many resources, and a great way. A lot of our social studies teachers attend the National Council for Social Studies annual conference each year, and that is such a wonderful way for teachers to learn about the hundreds of resources that are out there to help social studies teachers bring it alive in their classroom.
Great, really great insight. I appreciate that, and I'm sure all the teachers listening in do as well. So, Mary, I think that is all the time we have for questions today. If you want to go ahead and proceed.
Thank you very much, Valerie, and thanks to our attendees for your great questions, and thanks to our panelists for an engaging discussion. One final comment before I give some closing remarks. Look at the headlines in the next day, yesterday, recent times. All of these headlines, whether they're international, national, state, or local, Nepal, Baltimore, cases before the Supreme Court, these are challenging, difficult, and important topics. They all relate to civics, geography, and U.S. history, and we've heard from our panelists and Dr. Carr about the importance of these subject areas and these assessments in the nation's report card. I hope today's event inspires you to learn more about and continue the conversation about the results of the nation's report card, 2014 U.S. history, geography, and civics. Please visit nationsreportcard.gov to see the report and take a deeper look at the findings. And for more materials, including a news release, statements from our panelists, and the frameworks guiding these 3 assessments, visit the Governing Board's website. I would also call your attention to a video statement we received last night from Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee regarding the nation's report card in these subject areas. In a few days, you will also be able to find an archived version of today's webinar on that website. The Governing Board just released its first ever quarterly newsletter. Sign up at nagb.org to make sure you don't miss the latest from the Governing Board. And you can also stay up to date by following the Governing Board on Facebook and Twitter. And remember, continue the online discussion about these findings using the hashtag NAEP. Journalists with additional questions about the report should contact the Governing Board's Public Affairs Specialist, Stefan Harris. In closing, I'd like to thank Peggy, Chastity, and Michelle, and of course, thanks to all of you for your participation today.
Ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude today's webinar. You may now disconnect.